Picture this: Athens, Greece, around 400 BC. The city is buzzing, the markets are packed. Philosophers are arguing in every corner, and right in the middle of all that chaos lives one of the most brilliant minds in human history. But here is the kicker. This guy, the father of Western philosophy, the man who inspired Plato, who inspired Aristotle, who essentially shaped the way we think about everything from ethics to politics to science, this man lived in what most people today would describe as a dump. And honestly, that is one of the most fascinating things about him. So buckle up, because today we are stepping inside the home and the daily life of Socrates, and I promise you, it is nothing like what you would expect. Now, before we even get to the house itself, let us set the scene a little bit. Athens in the 5th century BC was not some dusty old ruin. It was alive. It was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. You had artists, architects, mathematicians, playwrights, all rubbing shoulders in the agora, which was basically the city square where people came to shop, gossip, debate, and just generally be loud and Greek about everything. The city was coming off a golden age. The Parthenon had just been built. Democracy was a fresh and exciting idea. And in the middle of all this energy and ambition, Socrates was walking around barefoot, wearing the same raggedy cloak, asking everyone uncomfortable questions. Wild, right? So where did this man actually live? Here is where it gets interesting. Socrates was born in a neighborhood of Athens called Alapike, which was just south of the city center. His father, Sophroniscus, was a stonemason, and his mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife. Now, some scholars believe that Socrates himself worked as a stonemason early in his life. And there are even ancient stories suggesting that he carved a group of statues of the Graces that supposedly stood at the entrance to the Acropolis. Whether that is true or not, what we do know is that he did not come from money. He was not from the elite. He was a craftsman's kid who grew up in a modest home in a working-class part of Athens. Does that blow your mind a little? The man who essentially invented the art of critical thinking started life as the son of a blue-collar worker. Now, when we say modest home, we are not talking about a cozy little cottage with a white picket fence. We are talking about a Greek house from the 5th century BC, which looked very different from what most of us imagine. Ancient Athenian homes were built around a central courtyard. From the street, you would see almost nothing. The exterior walls were plain, usually mud brick, completely windowless, or with only tiny high windows to keep out the heat. You stepped through a wooden door into a kind of entrance passage, and then suddenly the house opened up into this inner courtyard, open to the sky, with rooms arranged around it. There would be a well or a cistern for water, maybe an altar for household religious rituals, and a small garden if the family was lucky. Privacy was the whole point. Life happened inside, not outside. Now here is something that gives you a real sense of just how different things were back then. In a typical Athenian home of this period, the spaces were divided by gender. The women of the household, including the wife, daughters, and female slaves, lived and spent most of their time in a section of the house called the gynekon, which was usually at the back or on the upper floor. The front rooms and the main hall, called the andron, were for men and for entertaining male guests. So when Socrates had his famous conversations with other philosophers, with young students, with politicians who came to be grilled by him, that usually happened in the andron, the men's room of the house. And by all accounts, Socrates used every available space as a classroom. The street, the gymnasium, the market, and yes, his own home. But here is the part that really makes you think. Socrates, unlike many of his contemporaries, had an almost aggressive indifference to comfort and material things. He was famously described by people who knew him as someone who wore the same cloak summer and winter, went barefoot through snow, and seemed genuinely unbothered by hunger, cold, or physical hardship. His student Xenophon wrote about him with a kind of admiring disbelief, like, how does this guy just not care about any of the stuff that the rest of us care about? And Plato, in multiple dialogues, has other characters marveling at Socrates walking around in winter without sandals like it was totally normal. Does that not make you wonder what his deal was? Like, was this a philosophy thing, or was this just the most extreme case of not caring what anyone thinks? The answer is both, actually. Socrates had a very deliberate philosophy about the body and its needs. He believed that getting too attached to physical comfort was a trap, that if you needed luxury, If you needed fancy food and soft beds and expensive clothes to feel okay, then you were essentially a slave to those things. Real freedom, in his view, came from needing as little as possible. He was not suffering when he went without. He genuinely did not care. And he made this point constantly, almost annoyingly, to anyone who would listen. There is a famous story of him walking through a market and looking at all the goods on display and saying something like, "How many things there are that I do not need." That was his whole vibe. Minimalism before minimalism was a word. So what did his actual house look like on the inside? Based on what we know about typical Athenian homes of the period and the economic level of Socrates and his family, it would have been simple. The floors were probably packed earth or plain stone. The walls inside might have had some simple plaster, maybe a whitewash. The furniture would have been basic, a few low wooden beds that doubled as couches during the day, small tables, clay pots and jars for storing food and water, some wool blankets. There were no closets. Clothes and possessions were stored in chests or hung on pegs on the wall. Lighting at night came from small clay oil lamps. The kitchen was usually a separate outdoor area or a corner of the courtyard where cooking was done over an open fire. Sanitation was basic. Chamber pots, public toilets in the city, and a whole lot of incense to deal with the smells of ancient urban life. And speaking of which, here is something that does not get talked about enough when we romanticize ancient Athens. The city smelled. A lot. You had animals being brought to market, open sewers, public sacrifices at temples, tanneries, metalworkers, fishmongers, all within close quarters. The agora where Socrates loved to hang out was not a pristine marble plaza. It was a loud, chaotic, smelly, beautiful mess of human activity. And Socrates was right there in the middle of it, every day, just vibing. Seriously, does that not paint a completely different picture than the serene marble statues we usually see? Now what about his family life? Socrates was married to a woman named Xanthippe, and she has gone down in history with a pretty rough reputation. Ancient sources describe her as sharp-tongued, difficult, and frequently losing her patience with her philosopher husband, who spent all day arguing with strangers instead of making money. There are stories, probably exaggerated, of her pouring water over his head in frustration, of loud arguments that Socrates endured with the same unruffled calm he brought to everything else. But here is a more generous reading. Xanthippe was raising their children, managing the household, dealing with the very real material pressures of poverty, while her husband wandered around the city doing philosophy for free. From her perspective, it is not hard to understand the frustration. They had 3 sons together, and the family lived simply, often relying on the support of wealthy friends and admirers like Crito, who had a kind of financial patronage relationship with Socrates. What does that say about how we romanticize thinkers and ignore the practical people who keep their lives running? That is worth sitting with for a second. Socrates never charged for his teaching. This was actually a point of pride for him, and a huge contrast with the sophists, who were professional teachers that charged fees for their instruction in rhetoric and argumentation. Socrates thought that charging for wisdom was basically a corruption of the whole enterprise. Wisdom, in his view, was not something you sold. It was something you pursued together, in conversation, by questioning everything, including your own assumptions. But the practical consequence of this noble stance was that he had basically no income. So how did they survive? A combination of Xanthippe managing whatever resources they had, the generosity of rich friends, and the general Greek cultural norm of hospitality and patron relationships. But it was tight. The house was modest because the budget was modest. Now here is a fascinating detail about the physical space where some of Socrates' most famous conversations happened. Plato's dialogues describe several settings: the gymnasium, the street outside a friend's house, a wealthy man's home for a dinner party, the courts of Athens. But some of the most intimate conversations seem to have happened in what the Greeks called the palaestra, the exercise grounds attached to gymnasiums. These were semi-public spaces where young men trained, and where older men came to watch, discuss, and argue. Think of it as a combination gym and coffee house. Socrates loved these spaces. He would find someone who thought they knew something, start asking polite questions, and by the end of the conversation, the poor person would realize they had no idea what they were talking about. This technique became known as the Socratic method. And a lot of people found it deeply irritating, which is eventually a big part of why he ended up on trial. But back to the home, here is something that I find genuinely moving about Socrates and his domestic life. In Plato's Phaedo, one of the most powerful dialogues ever written, we get a glimpse of Socrates in his final hours. And even in that moment, in the prison cell where he spent his last day, he was calm, he was curious, he was talking philosophy with his friends. Xanthippe was there early in the morning, weeping and holding their youngest child. And when she was led away because she was becoming distressed, Socrates turned to his friends and continued the conversation. His home, in the deepest sense of the word, was not a building. It was the world of ideas. He was at home wherever there was a good question to be asked. So what does a philosopher's home 2,400 years ago actually tell us? It tells us that the house was small and plain, built of mud brick around an open courtyard, furnished with the minimum, lit by oil lamps, smelling of wood smoke and Mediterranean herbs, and the general reality of ancient city life. It tells us that Socrates slept on a simple bed, ate simple food, wore a single cloak, and walked everywhere without shoes. It tells us that his wife managed a household under real economic pressure while he pursued a life of the mind. And it tells us that the greatest philosophical tradition in Western history began not in a palace or a university, but in the small rooms and crowded streets of a working-class neighborhood in Athens. There is something genuinely radical about that. We live in a world that constantly tells us that success looks a certain way, that it requires the right address, the right clothes, the right car, the right kind of polish. And here is Socrates, arguably one of the most influential humans who ever lived, walking around barefoot and asking, yeah, but what does any of that actually mean? What is the good life really? Does owning more stuff make you wiser? Does comfort make you free? And honestly, 2,400 years later, we are still not sure we have a great answer to those questions. Does that not give you something to chew on? The irony is that we know Socrates through marble. Smooth, white, noble-looking statues in museums, busts of a man with a broad forehead and an intense gaze. But the real Socrates was apparently not conventionally handsome at all. His friends described him as short, stocky, with a flat nose and bulging eyes. And yet everyone who spent time with him found him irresistible to talk to. There was something about his energy, his humor, his relentless curiosity that people could not get enough of. He was the life of every party he attended, and he attended a lot of them. He could drink everyone under the table and wake up the next morning fresh as anything, ready to start philosophizing again. That detail always makes me smile. The father of Western philosophy was also a guy you wanted at your dinner party. He observed everything. He questioned everything. He lived in a small mud brick house in Athens, wore the same cloak every day, and never wrote a single word that we know of. Everything we have is second-hand, filtered through the writings of his students, and yet his questions are still alive. They are still being argued in philosophy departments and dinner tables and late-night conversations all over the world. Not bad for a barefoot stonemason's kid from Alapeek. So the next time someone tells you that you need the right setup, the right environment, the right resources to do something meaningful with your life, remember Socrates, the man who changed how humans think about everything, did it without a fancy house, without money, without a desk or a notebook, or even a decent pair of sandals. He just showed up every day, asked the hard questions, and refused to pretend he knew more than he did. And somehow, that turned out to be enough to echo through 24 centuries and land right here in your ears. Today. If that is not the most old-school underdog story you have ever heard, I honestly do not know what to tell you.